The cold bit into Samantha's cheeks as she tightened her scarf around her neck. Seated on a damp cardboard box at the corner of Fifth Avenue, she watched the world rush by. A blur of wool coats, leather boots, and hurried steps. The holiday lights overhead flickered cheerily, a cruel contrast to the gnawing hunger in her stomach. She clutched a small sign made from torn cardboard. "Just a meal, please." Across the street, Alexander Davenport stepped out of the grand entrance of a luxury hotel, his tailored overcoat framing his lean figure. At 38, he exuded power, his every movement precise and purposeful. He adjusted the cufflinks on his Italian suit, barely noticing the doorman's cheerful, "Good evening, sir." His thoughts were already miles away, consumed by the numbers and projections that dominated his world. Alexander's eyes scanned the street for his driver when something caught his attention. A figure hunched against the cold. Samantha. He didn't mean to stop, but something about the way her trembling fingers held that sign drew him closer. Before he could think better of it, their eyes met. "Sir?" Samantha's voice was hoarse but steady. "Could you spare anything? Just for some food." Alexander's first instinct was to walk away. He was a man of business, not sentiment. But her words struck a nerve, a faint echo of something he couldn't quite place. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice clipped but curious. "Samantha," she replied, her gaze unwavering despite the frost in his tone. "And I'm not asking for charity. Just help." Alexander frowned. "And what would you do with it?" "Eat," she replied simply, holding his gaze. "Do you ever stop to think about the lives behind the numbers you chase?" The words hit harder than Alexander cared to admit. With a sigh, he pulled a crisp $50 bill from his wallet and handed it to her. "Here, get something warm." But as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him again. "Thank you, but money isn't what I need most." Alexander paused, something in her tone compelling him to turn back. "What do you mean?" She gestured to a small diner across the street. "Just share a meal with me. Talk to me. I promise it won't take long." It was absurd. A man like him, sharing a table with a homeless woman? His instinct screamed to walk away, but his curiosity, and perhaps a twinge of guilt, got the better of him. "All right," he said reluctantly, "but just one meal." Inside the diner, the warmth was a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. Samantha wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of coffee, savoring the heat as Alexander sat across from her, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. "So, Samantha," he began, his tone formal. "What's your story?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "A little too long for a dinner conversation. Let's just say, life didn't quite go as planned." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like you belong out there." "Neither do most people," she countered, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "But life has a way of surprising you." As the conversation unfolded, Samantha spoke of losing her job as a librarian, of mounting bills, and of the night she lost her apartment. She talked about her resilience, her dreams of finding stable work again, and the kindness of strangers that had kept her going. Alexander, in turn, found himself sharing more than he intended, his relentless drive for success, the isolation it had brought, and the emptiness that no amount of wealth seemed to fill. "You work so hard," Samantha said softly. "But for what?" "For control," Alexander admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "In my world, control is everything." Samantha smiled, her gaze both understanding and challenging. "And does it make you happy?" He didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. As the night wore on, something shifted between them. Alexander saw Samantha not as a statistic or a problem to solve, but as a person, a survivor with more strength than he could fathom. And Samantha saw in Alexander a man weighed down by his own success, searching for something he couldn't quite name. When they parted ways, Alexander handed her his business card, an impulsive gesture he couldn't explain. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice softer now, "call me." Samantha took the card, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Alexander." As he walked away, the cold air biting at his face, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this brief encounter had set something in motion, something that would change them both in ways neither could predict. The hum of the diner was a comforting backdrop as Alexander and Samantha sat at their booth. Outside, snowflakes swirled under the streetlights, casting a soft glow over the icy sidewalks. Samantha's hands still clutched the warm coffee mug, as though drawing strength from it, while Alexander leaned back, his posture guarded, but his eyes curiously fixed on the woman across from him. "Tell me," Alexander said, his voice carrying the same cool tone of authority he used in boardrooms. "Why did you ask me to share a meal instead of just taking the money?" Samantha smiled faintly, her lips cracked from the cold, but her expression warm. "Because I've learned that money doesn't fix everything. Sometimes what you need most is for someone to listen." Alexander arched a brow. "And you think I'm that someone?" "I think," Samantha began, her gaze unwavering, "that even people like you, especially people like you, need to remember what it's like to be human." Her words landed like a punch to his chest. For a moment, Alexander considered pushing back, dismissing her as another idealist who didn't understand the harsh realities of success. But something about her tone, earnest, almost maternal, silenced his retort. As their conversation continued, Samantha's story began to unfold. She spoke of her childhood in a small town, where dreams seemed as distant as the stars. She described the years of struggle, working her way through college to become a librarian, a job she had cherished until budget cuts forced her out. "It wasn't just losing the job," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was losing the purpose it gave me, the connection to people." Alexander nodded, though he couldn't fully relate. He had never known the kind of purpose tied to others. His purpose had always been about himself, about winning, achieving, conquering. "What happened after that?" he asked, his tone softer now. Samantha hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "I tried to keep up with the bills, but the debts piled up faster than I could pay them. One day, I came home to find an eviction notice on the door. I slept in my car for weeks before it was towed." Alexander frowned. "And your family? Friends?" "They've got their own struggles," Samantha replied, her smile bittersweet. "And pride's a tricky thing. You don't realize how much you have until you lose it." For the first time, Alexander felt a pang of guilt, not because of anything he had done, but because of everything he hadn't. He had spent his life blind to stories like hers, dismissing them as background noise in his pursuit of wealth. As the evening stretched into night, Alexander found himself sharing more than he intended. He spoke of the pressure he faced growing up as the son of a ruthless businessman, of how success was drilled into him as the only measure of worth. "My father used to say, 'Feelings are for people who can't win,'" Alexander said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. "So, I learned not to feel." "And does that make you happy?" Samantha asked gently. The question caught Alexander off guard. He had spent years chasing happiness through achievements, yet now, faced with a woman who had nothing, he realized he couldn't answer. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand, in a gesture that was both simple and profound. Maybe it's time to find out. By the time they left the diner, the streets were quiet, blanketed in fresh snow. Alexander offered to call a cab for Samantha, but she declined. "I'll be fine," she said, pulling her threadbare coat tighter around her. "This isn't my first winter out here." Alexander hesitated, then handed her his scarf. "Take it." She blinked in surprise, then smiled, a genuine radiant smile that made Alexander's chest tighten. "Thank you." As she walked away, her figure disappearing into the snowy night, Alexander felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He told himself it was just concern, maybe pity, but deep down, he knew it was something more. Back in his penthouse, Alexander couldn't focus. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows, usually a source of pride, now felt hollow. The city lights glittered like false promises, mocking his loneliness. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the warmth of the alcohol did little to soothe him. Samantha's words echoed in his mind. "Do you ever stop to think about the lives behind those numbers you chase?" Alexander shook his head, frustrated by how much her words had affected him. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Samantha was more than coincidence. It was a wake-up call. Meanwhile, Samantha found shelter in a crowded women's center. The air was heavy, with the scent of unwashed clothes and antiseptic, but it was warm, and that was enough. She curled up on a cot, clutching the scarf Alexander had given her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. Alexander had seen her, truly seen her, and though she didn't know if she would ever see him again, she held on to the possibility that their encounter might lead to something better. As she drifted off to sleep, a single tear slid down her cheek. It wasn't from sadness, but from the fragile, stubborn belief that even in the darkest times, light could find its way through. The morning light spilled through the narrow window of the shelter, painting the walls with a soft, golden hue. Samantha woke up to the muffled sounds of the city, a distant siren, the hum of traffic, the occasional chatter from the other women. She stretched, feeling the weight of exhaustion still clinging to her body. It had been weeks since her encounter with Alexander, and while life hadn't magically transformed, she found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. One crisp morning, as Samantha walked through the park, after finishing a part-time shift at a local diner, a wave of nausea hit her like a freight train. She stumbled to a bench, clutching her stomach and trying to catch her breath. The dizziness passed, but a nagging suspicion crept into her mind. "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "It's just stress." But as the days passed, the symptoms grew harder to ignore. The nausea, the fatigue, the strange sensitivity to smells. Each one was a whisper she couldn't silence. Eventually, Samantha found herself at a free clinic, sitting in a starkly lit room, as a nurse returned with a small white stick in hand. "Congratulations," the nurse said, her tone kind but reserved. "You're pregnant." The words hit Samantha like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. She stared at the nurse, her mind racing. Pregnant? How? The answer was clear, but the implications were overwhelming. She barely had enough to keep herself afloat, and now there was a child to consider. Samantha spent the next few days in a daze, grappling with the reality of her situation. She considered reaching out to Alexander, but quickly dismissed the idea. The man she met was kind in fleeting moments, but ultimately cold, focused, and detached. What would he care about her pregnancy? Instead, she doubled down on her efforts to find stability. She picked up more shifts, cleaned tables until her hands were raw, and scrimped every penny to save for her future child. The shelter provided her with a safe place to sleep, but Samantha knew it wasn't a permanent solution. The loneliness of her predicament weighed heavily on her. Nights became a battleground between exhaustion and fear, her mind cycling through questions with no easy answers. What kind of life could she give her child? How would she protect them from the harshness of the world? One evening, as Samantha sat in the dimly lit dining room of the shelter, poking at a bowl of lukewarm soup, her friend Mary Lopez slid into the seat across from her. "You've been quiet lately," Mary said, her voice tinged with concern. "What's going on?" Samantha hesitated, then sighed. "I'm pregnant." Mary's eyes widened, but her reaction was one of support rather than shock. "That's big news. Do you know what you're going to do?" Samantha shook her head. "I'm trying to figure it out. I don't even know if I should tell the father." Mary leaned closer, her expression serious. "If he's part of this, he deserves to know. And you deserve the chance to see if he'll step up." Samantha considered her friend's words, but remained unconvinced. She didn't want to rely on anyone, especially not someone as seemingly unreachable as Alexander. Determined to provide for her child, Samantha took on more responsibilities at the diner where she worked part-time. She struck up a friendship with Margaret Daniels, a regular customer who always left generous tips. Margaret was a retired social worker with a keen sense of empathy and an eye for people in need. "You've got a strong spirit," Margaret said one day, handing Samantha an extra $20. "If you ever need anything, you let me know." Those words became a lifeline for Samantha. Knowing someone believed in her gave her the strength to keep going, even when the odds felt insurmountable. While Samantha fought to build a future for her unborn child, Alexander's life continued, as if their encounter had never happened. He closed deals, attended gala events, and added zeros to his bank account, all while feeling an inexplicable void growing within him. One night, as he stood in his penthouse overlooking the glittering city, Alexander found himself thinking about Samantha. Her words, her resilience, her piercing gaze, they had left a mark he couldn't erase. "Do you ever stop to think about the lives behind those numbers you chase?" Her voice echoed in his mind. Alexander shook his head, pouring himself another glass of scotch. He didn't have time for introspection. The world rewarded action, not sentiment. Yet no matter how much he tried to bury himself in work, the memory of Samantha lingered like a ghost. Months passed, and Samantha's pregnancy became more evident. The women at the shelter rallied around her, offering advice and support. Mary threw a small baby shower with donated clothes and blankets, bringing a rare smile to Samantha's face. "This baby is going to be so loved," Mary said, placing a hand on Samantha's growing belly. Samantha felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to dream of a better future. Not just for herself, but for her child. She imagined Ethan, as she had decided to name him, growing up strong and kind, unburdened by the struggles she faced. But reality soon intruded. Samantha's hours at the diner were cut, leaving her with barely enough to cover her basic needs. She struggled to find new work as her pregnancy progressed, facing judgment and rejection at every turn. One particularly cold night, Samantha sat alone in the park, her hands cradling her belly. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to her unborn child, "I'm trying. I promise I'm trying." As Ethan's due date approached, Samantha found herself overwhelmed with both anticipation and fear. Margaret, sensing her struggle, offered to connect her with additional resources, including a more stable shelter for mothers and children. "You are not alone," Margaret said firmly. "There are people who want to help you. Let them." Samantha nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it head-on. Unbeknownst to Samantha, Alexander's life was about to intersect with hers again. As the city moved forward with its relentless pace, their paths were slowly but surely converging. The decisions they made in the coming months would set the stage for a reunion that neither could have anticipated, a meeting that would challenge their beliefs, reshape their futures, and ultimately redefine what it meant to be a family. The rain fell steadily against the windows of the free clinic, the rhythmic tapping a gentle counterpoint to the tension inside. Samantha sat in the worn waiting room chair, her hands clasped tightly around a faded hospital bracelet. Her contractions were close now, the pain coursing through her body like a relentless tide. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Today wasn't just the end of a long, grueling chapter. It was the beginning of a new one. Hours passed in a haze of pain and determination. Samantha gritted her teeth, clutching the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction hit. The nurse, a kind woman named Trina, coached her through each step. "Breathe, Samantha," Trina said gently. "You're doing great." Samantha nodded, her breaths ragged. She focused on Trina's voice, clinging to it like a lifeline. All the struggles, the sleepless nights, the hunger, it had all led to this moment. Finally, with one last gut-wrenching push, the room was filled with the unmistakable cry of a newborn. Samantha collapsed back onto the bed, tears streaming down her face as the nurse placed a tiny, squirming bundle in her arms. "It's a boy," Trina said softly, smiling down at her. "Congratulations." Samantha looked down at her son, her heart swelling with an overwhelming mix of love and fear. "Ethan," she whispered. "His name is Ethan." The days after Ethan's birth were both beautiful and challenging. Samantha stayed at a transitional shelter for new mothers, run by Margaret Daniels, the social worker who had been her rock during the later months of her pregnancy. Margaret was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and an unshakable determination to help those in need. "You've got a fighter's spirit, Samantha," Margaret said one afternoon, as they sat together in the shelter's small kitchen. Ethan slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby. "I see it in you, and I see it in Ethan." Samantha managed a tired smile. "I just want him to have a chance at a better life." "And he will," Margaret said firmly, "because you're going to make it happen." Caring for a newborn in a shelter wasn't easy. The shared rooms offered little privacy, and the constant hum of activity meant that quiet moments were rare. But Samantha found joy in the small things. Ethan's first smile, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, the soft cooing sounds he made as he slept. Still, there were days when the weight of her situation felt unbearable. Samantha often sat by the window of the shelter, staring out at the bustling city and wondering if she had made the right choices. Was it enough to love Ethan fiercely? Could she shield him from the hardships that had shaped her own life? It was during one of these quiet moments that Samantha met Mary Lopez, a fellow mother at the shelter. Mary was a vivacious woman in her early 30s, with a quick wit and an endless supply of optimism. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Lily, who quickly took a liking to Ethan. "You're doing amazing, you know," Mary said one evening, as they folded donated baby clothes together. "Being a single mom is no joke, but you're handling it like a pro." Samantha laughed softly. "I don't feel like a pro. Half the time, I'm just figuring things out as I go." "That's motherhood," Mary said with a grin. "We're all just winging it." The two women became fast friends, finding solace and strength in each other's company. Mary's humor and resilience were a balm for Samantha's weary soul, and Samantha's quiet determination inspired Mary in turn. One evening, Margaret gathered the women of the shelter for a small celebration. A local church had donated food and supplies, and Margaret wanted to take the opportunity to lift everyone's spirits. This isn't just a meal, Margaret said, as she addressed the group. It's a reminder that we're not alone. There are people out there who care, who see our struggles and want to help. Samantha looked around the room, her gaze landing on Ethan, who lay swaddled in a blanket nearby. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the glittering skyline. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, power, influence, but the sense of satisfaction that had once driven him now felt hollow. "Sir, the board meeting is in 15 minutes, his assistant said, poking her head into the room. Alexander nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Lately, his mind kept drifting back to that night with Samantha. Her words, her resilience, her piercing gaze, they haunted him in a way he couldn't explain. Shaking off the feeling, Alexander stood and adjusted his tie. There was no time for introspection. The world of high finance didn't wait for anyone. Back at the shelter, Samantha celebrated Ethan's first milestone, his first laugh. The sound was like music, a bright, joyful note in the midst of her struggles. Mary captured the moment on her phone, promising to send Samantha the video as a keepsake. "That laugh could light up a room," Mary said with a grin. Samantha smiled, feeling a surge of pride. Ethan was her everything, her reason to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard things got. As the months passed, Samantha continued to build a life for herself and Ethan. She enrolled in a GED program, determined to finish her education and create a stable future for her son. Margaret and Mary cheered her on every step of the way, offering encouragement and practical support. Unbeknownst to Samantha, her path was on a collision course with Alexander's. Their lives, once intertwined for a brief moment, were destined to intersect again. And when they did, the choices they made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for themselves, but for Ethan as well. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the shelter's shared bedroom, painting the walls with soft streaks of light. Samantha cradled Ethan in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. This fragile, fleeting moment was her solace, a reminder of why she endured sleepless nights and relentless challenges. The day began like any other, but by the afternoon, Ethan had developed a fever. At first, Samantha brushed it off as a mild cold, but as his temperature climbed, panic set in. She held him close, feeling the heat radiating from his tiny body. "Margaret," Samantha called out, her voice trembling. "I think something's wrong with Ethan." Margaret rushed into the room, her experienced eyes scanning Ethan's flushed face and lethargic movements. "We need to get him to a clinic," she said firmly. "Now." The minutes that followed were a blur of hurried footsteps, anxious whispers, and the distant wail of a siren. At the clinic, Samantha sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Each second stretched into an eternity. When the doctor emerged with a reassuring nod, Samantha felt a wave of relief wash over her. "He'll be fine," the doctor said. "It's just a viral infection, but he'll need rest and fluids." That night, as Ethan lay asleep in his crib, Samantha's relief gave way to something deeper, an aching realization of how vulnerable she and her son truly were. Her mind drifted to Alexander, the man who had once been so close, yet so distant, the man who had left a mark on her life in more ways than one. She stared at her phone, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Finally, she dialed his number. The line rang twice before his familiar voice answered, cool and composed. "Samantha?" Alexander's surprise was evident, even over the phone. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I need your help." Across the city, Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, the view of Manhattan's skyline behind him. Samantha's call was the last thing he had expected. "Samantha," he said, his tone guarded. "It's been a long time." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I didn't want to do this, but it's about Ethan." "Ethan?" Alexander repeated, confusion flickering across his face. "Who's Ethan?" "Our son," she said softly, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice was laced with disbelief. "Samantha, are you saying—" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. "He's your son, Alexander, and he needs you." The following evening, they met at a small cafe far from the glitz and glamour of Alexander's usual haunts. Samantha arrived first, cradling Ethan in her arms. Her heart pounded as she watched the door, dreading his reaction. When Alexander walked in, he was every bit the picture of success, impeccably dressed, exuding confidence. But as his eyes landed on Samantha, and then on the baby in her arms, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He sat down slowly, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha nodded. "Yes, he's yours." Alexander reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing against Ethan's tiny fingers. The baby cooed softly, unaware of the tension between his parents. "He looks like me," Alexander murmured, a note of wonder in his voice. Samantha's eyes hardened. "He needs more than someone to notice a resemblance, Alexander. He needs a father." The conversation that followed was raw and emotional, each word a window into the pain and frustration both carried. "Samantha, you walked away, Alexander. You left without even looking back. And now I'm here, asking for your help, because I have no other choice." "Alexander, I didn't know, Samantha. You can't blame me for something I wasn't aware of." "Samantha, you're right. You didn't know. But now you do. So, what are you going to do about it?" The tension in the air was palpable, each sentence heavy with unspoken truths. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself at a loss for words. Despite his initial resistance, something in Alexander began to shift. He couldn't ignore the tug of responsibility or the undeniable connection he felt when he looked at Ethan. He offered to cover Ethan's medical expenses, a small gesture that marked the beginning of his journey toward change. Samantha, though wary, accepted his help. "This isn't about money, Alexander," she said. "It's about showing up, being there for him." Alexander nodded, his mind racing. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed world felt unstable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would define the course of his life. As Alexander left the cafe that night, he found himself looking back at Samantha and Ethan through the glass window. The sight of them, so fragile, yet so strong, stirred something deep within him. For Samantha, the meeting was a tentative step toward hope. She had no guarantees that Alexander would rise to the occasion, but for Ethan's sake, she had to try. And for Alexander, the encounter marked the beginning of an internal struggle. Between the man he had been and the man he could become, the air in Alexander's office felt heavy, weighed down by the events of the past few days. He sat at his desk, the sleek mahogany surface cluttered with papers he hadn't touched. His thoughts kept circling back to the cafe, to Samantha's fierce eyes, and the fragile innocence of the child she claimed was his. Ethan. The name echoed in his mind like a bell, unsettling and persistent. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself grappling with uncertainty. His entire life had been a symphony of control, precision, and calculated moves. But now, The existence of Ethan had disrupted his rhythm, forcing him to confront emotions he had long buried. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glittering lights, once symbols of his success, now seemed cold and hollow. His assistant, Olivia, entered quietly holding a folder. "Mr. Carter," she said tentatively, "you have a meeting in 10 minutes. Alexander waved her off, his voice distant. "Reschedule it. I'm not in the mood." Olivia hesitated, her brow furrowed in concern, but she nodded and left without another word. Alexander couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's small fingers gripping his own, a gesture so simple yet profoundly moving. Meanwhile, across town, Samantha sat on the edge of her bed at the shelter, watching Ethan play with a makeshift toy, a wooden spoon and an old saucepan. His laughter filled the small room, a bright contrast to her weary expression. Mary, Samantha's closest friend at the shelter, entered with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you need this," she did, handing one to Samantha. "Thanks," Samantha replied with a tired smile. Mary sat beside her, glancing at Ethan. "How'd the meeting go? Did he agree to help?" Samantha sighed, her fingers tightening around the cup. "He said he'd cover Ethan's medical expenses, but I don't know, Mary. He seemed so detached, like he's doing it out of obligation, not because he cares." "Maybe it's a start," Mary offered gently. "Sometimes people need time to adjust, especially someone like him." Samantha nodded, but doubt lingered in her heart. She couldn't afford to hope too much, not when Ethan's future was at stake. A week later, Alexander found himself standing outside the shelter, a small box in his hands. Inside were toys, clothes, and a few books he had picked out himself. It was an impulsive decision, one that surprised even him. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't experienced since his first major business deal. Margaret answered, her sharp eyes scanning him before softening. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "This is unexpected. I wanted to see Ethan," Alexander said, shifting awkwardly. "And Samantha, if she's available." Margaret nodded and led him inside. The shelter was modest but clean, with the hum of quiet activity in the background. When Samantha appeared, her expression was a mix of surprise and suspicion. "You're here," she said simply. Alexander held up the box, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "I thought Ethan might like these." Samantha hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Ethan, sitting on the floor with his saucepan toy, looked up with wide eyes. When he saw the box, his face lit up, and he crawled toward it eagerly. As Alexander knelt beside Ethan, helping him explore the new toys, Samantha watched from a distance. There was something different about Alexander today, a softness, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "He likes you," Samantha said quietly, breaking the silence. Alexander looked up, his expression unreadable. "He's incredible," he admitted. "I didn't expect to feel this way." Samantha's eyes softened. "He is, and he deserves the world, Alexander. I can't give him that alone." "I know," Alexander said, his voice resolute. "I want to help, not just financially. I want to be there for him." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that neither could ignore. Over the next few weeks, Alexander began visiting Ethan regularly. At first, the visits were awkward and formal, but gradually a bond began to form. Ethan's laughter became a constant in Alexander's world, a reminder of the joy he had long forgotten. One afternoon, as Alexander pushed Ethan on a swing at a nearby park, Samantha watched from a bench, her heart a jumble of emotions. Mary sat beside her, a knowing smile on her face. "He's trying," Mary said. You have to give him that. I know, Samantha replied, her voice tinged with hope and caution. But it's hard to trust someone who's been absent for so long. Mary placed a hand on Samantha's shoulder. Sometimes people surprise you. As Alexander's involvement grew, so did the challenges. His board of directors began to question his commitment to the company, whispering about his distractions. At the same time, the media caught wind of his connection to Samantha and Ethan, leading to a flurry of headlines and invasive questions. Mr. Carter, is it true you have an illegitimate child? One reporter shouted as Alexander exited his office building. How do you respond to claims that you've abandoned your responsibilities as CEO? Another asked. Alexander ignored them, his jaw clenched. But the pressure was mounting. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Samantha confronted Alexander. What's going on? She demanded. I've seen the headlines. Are they affecting your work? Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. They are. But it doesn't matter. Ethan matters. You matter. Samantha's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. I won't let you destroy your life over this, Alexander. You don't have to prove anything to me. I'm not doing this to prove anything, he replied. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Despite the challenges, Alexander and Samantha found themselves drawn closer together, united by their love for Ethan. They began to navigate the complexities of co-parenting, each learning to trust the other in new and unexpected ways. For Alexander, the experience was transformative. The man who had once prioritized profit above all else now found himself prioritizing bedtime stories, doctor's appointments, and late-night talks with Samantha. For Samantha, the journey was one of healing. She began to see Alexander not as the cold, detached businessman she had first met, but as a man capable of growth and redemption. The city bustled with its usual vigor, the hum of life vibrating through the streets. But for Alexander Carter, it felt as though the world had slowed. His life, once a whirlwind of meetings, deals, and deadlines, now revolved around moments that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or corporate success. Ethan's laughter, Samantha's resilience, and the fragile thread of connection weaving their lives together had become his focus. Yet, the path ahead was far from simple. As the weeks passed, Alexander proposed a formal arrangement. He invited Samantha to dinner, not at a high-end restaurant, but at a modest cafe near her shelter. I want to talk about how we move forward, Alexander began, his voice steady but hesitant. Samantha tilted her head, studying him. Move forward. Are you talking about co-parenting or something else? Alexander placed his hands on the table, fingers interlaced. Both. I want to be a real father to Ethan, not just someone who visits occasionally. Samantha frowned. That's a big step, Alexander. You've barely spent time with him. What if this is just guilt talking? Alexander's jaw tightened. It's not guilt, Samantha. It's clarity. For the first time, I see what matters. Their conversation delved into logistics, from how often Alexander would see Ethan to the possibility of financial support beyond essentials. But the deeper issue lingered unspoken. Their relationship. While Alexander worked on his role as a father, Samantha took a leap of her own. Encouraged by Mary and Margaret, she enrolled in night classes to finish her degree in education. The idea of stepping into a classroom, not as a homeless mother, but as a teacher, gave her hope. One evening, as Samantha sat at a shared table in the shelter, poring over textbooks, Ethan toddled over, with a crayon-scribbled picture. "Mommy, look," he said, holding up the paper. Samantha smiled, her eyes misting. "That's beautiful, baby." Mary, sitting nearby, leaned over. He's got your creativity. Samantha laughed softly. Maybe. I just hope I can give him the stability he deserves. Mary's smile faded slightly. And Alexander? Do you think he'll stick around? Samantha sighed, glancing at Ethan. I want to believe he will. For Ethan's sake, I have to. At Carter Industries, Alexander faced growing tensions. His renewed focus on personal matters had not gone unnoticed. Board members whispered about his distractions, and investors grew impatient with the perceived instability. During a quarterly meeting, one board member, Charles Manning, voiced his concerns. Mr. Carter, while we appreciate your vision, your recent preoccupations have raised questions about your commitment to the company. Alexander met Charles's gaze, unflinching. My commitment to this company hasn't wavered. But let me be clear. Success isn't just about profit margins. It's about integrity and purpose. The room fell silent. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Alexander knew he was walking a tightrope. The media frenzy surrounding Alexander's involvement with Samantha escalated when a tabloid published a photo of the three of them at a park. The headline read, From CEO to Father, Alexander Carter's Secret Life Revealed. Samantha was livid. Did you know this would happen? She demanded, holding up the newspaper. Alexander shook his head. Of course not. But I'll handle it. Samantha's eyes flashed. How? By spinning it into some PR stunt? Alexander stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Number. By protecting you and Ethan. To counter the narrative, Alexander held a press conference. I won't comment on my personal life beyond this. My son and his mother are not subjects for speculation. I ask for privacy, not for my sake, but for theirs. The gesture earned mixed reactions. Some admired his stance, while others accused him of hiding the full story. One night, Ethan developed a severe fever. Samantha, terrified, called Alexander. He arrived within minutes, rushing them to the hospital. The hours of waiting were agonizing. In the sterile hospital room, Samantha sat beside Ethan's bed, her hand on his tiny arm. Alexander stood by the window, his fists clenched. He's strong, Alexander said, more to himself than to Samantha. He'll be okay. Samantha looked at him, her voice trembling. He has to be. He's all I have. Alexander turned, his expression softening. You're not alone in this anymore, Samantha. The ordeal brought them closer, forcing Alexander to confront the depth of his feelings, not just for Ethan, but for Samantha. After Ethan's recovery, Margaret invited Alexander and Samantha to her office. You two have come a long way, she began, her voice warm but firm. But there's still work to be done. What do you mean? Alexander asked. Margaret leaned forward. You're building a bridge, but it's fragile. Trust takes time, and you need to be patient with each other and with yourselves. Samantha nodded, her gaze meeting Alexander's. She's right. This isn't just about us. It's about Ethan. Alexander reached for Samantha's hand, a gesture that surprised them both. I know. And I'm all in. The autumn breeze swept through the city streets, carrying with it a sense of change. For Samantha and Alexander, life had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Their tentative partnership revolved around Ethan, who had become the bridge that connected their worlds. Yet, beneath the surface, challenges simmered, waiting to disrupt the fragile harmony they had built. Ethan, now a curious toddler, had a way of disarming even the most guarded hearts. His laughter filled Samantha's small apartment, and his innocent questions often caught Alexander off guard. Daddy, why don't you stay here with Mommy and me? Ethan asked one evening, as Alexander tucked him into bed. Alexander froze, his hand still on the blanket. Well, buddy, I have a home too, but I'll always come back to see you. Ethan's small face scrunched in thought. But we're a family, right? Samantha, standing in the doorway, watched the exchange with a mixture of warmth and sadness. Alexander looked up at her, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. While Ethan brought light into their lives, Samantha faced mounting pressures, balancing her night classes part-time job, and caring for Ethan left her exhausted. Mary, her closest friend at the shelter, often stepped in to help, but the weight of her responsibilities was overwhelming. One night, after finishing an assignment, Samantha broke down in tears. Mary sat beside her, offering a comforting arm. "You're doing great, Sam. Don't let the pressure get to you." Samantha sniffled. "I just want to give Ethan the life he deserves. Sometimes it feels impossible." Mary squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone." At Carter Industries, Alexander was waging a silent battle of his own. His focus on family had not gone unnoticed by his colleagues, and whispers of dissatisfaction among the board grew louder. Charles Manning, a senior executive, called a meeting to address concerns. "Alexander," Charles began, his tone measured but firm, "your recent decisions have raised questions about your priorities. We need reassurance that the company isn't taking a back seat." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "The company is in a strong position, Charles. My personal life doesn't affect my ability to lead." Charles exchanged glances with the other executives. "We're not questioning your leadership, but perception matters. Investors want stability." After the meeting, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. He knew he couldn't let his personal life overshadow his professional obligations, but finding balance seemed increasingly difficult. The media had not forgotten about Alexander's connection to Samantha. A new tabloid article surfaced, insinuating that Samantha was using her son to manipulate Alexander. The headline read, "From Shelter to Penthouse, How Samantha Blake Snared a Billionaire." Samantha discovered the article when a coworker showed it to her. Her face burned with humiliation as she read the lies. "That's not true," Samantha exclaimed, her voice trembling. "I never." Mary intervened, snatching the phone away. "Don't let it get to you, Sam. People love gossip, but it doesn't define you." Later that day, Samantha confronted Alexander. "Did you see the article?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "I did. I've already instructed my legal team to handle it." Samantha crossed her arms. "Handle it? How? By suing them? That won't stop people from believing it." Alexander stepped closer, his voice softening. "I know this is hard, but we can't let them control the narrative. The people who matter know the truth." Margaret Daniels, ever the voice of reason, invited Alexander and Samantha to her office for a candid conversation. You two are under a microscope," Margaret began, her tone firm. "But you have a choice. Let the scrutiny divide you, or use it to strengthen your bond." Samantha looked skeptical. "How do we do that?" Margaret smiled. "By showing people who you really are. Actions speak louder than headlines. Focus on Ethan, on your goals, and on supporting each other." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We can't control what people say, but we can control how we respond." As the media frenzy continued, an unlikely ally emerged. Claire Hastings, a journalist who had covered Alexander's career for years, published a heartfelt op-ed titled, "Behind the Headlines, A Story of Redemption and Resilience." Claire wrote about Samantha's courage, Alexander's transformation, and their shared commitment to building a better future for Ethan. The article went viral, shifting public opinion in their favor. When Alexander read the piece, He reached out to Claire. "Thank you," he said over the phone. "Your words mean more than you know." Claire replied warmly, "The truth deserves to be told, Alexander. Don't let anyone take that from you." One evening, Alexander surprised Samantha and Ethan with tickets to a children's play. Ethan's excitement was infectious as they watched the whimsical performance. Afterward, as they strolled through the park, Ethan ran ahead, chasing fireflies. Alexander and Samantha walked side by side, the tension between them easing. "Thank you for tonight," Samantha said softly. "Ethan had so much fun." Alexander smiled. "I did too. It's nice to step away from everything for a while." Samantha hesitated before asking, "Do you ever regret meeting me?" Alexander stopped, turning to face her. "Regret? Number meeting. You changed my life, Samantha. You and Ethan are the best things that ever happened to me." Her eyes shimmered with emotion, but she quickly looked away. I don't want to hold you back." "You're not," Alexander said firmly. "If anything, you've made me better." The tension in Alexander and Samantha's lives came to a head as external pressures mounted. Between corporate challenges, public scrutiny, and personal insecurities, they found themselves pushed to their limits. Yet, amidst the chaos, their bond grew stronger, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and discover the resilience they never knew they had. At Carter Industries, the storm brewing for months finally hit. A major client announced their decision to pull out of a multi-million-dollar deal, citing concerns over the ongoing media controversy surrounding Alexander's personal life. The board convened an emergency meeting to address the crisis. "Alexander," Charles Manning began, his tone sharp, "this is exactly what we warned you about. Your personal decisions are costing the company." Alexander sat at the head of the table, his expression calm, but his knuckles white beneath the table. "I understand your concerns, Charles, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. We need to focus on rebuilding trust with our clients, not pointing fingers." Charles scoffed. "Rebuilding trust starts with a leader who prioritizes the company, not his personal affairs." Before Alexander could respond, one of the younger board members spoke up. "I disagree. Alexander's transparency and humanity are assets, not liabilities. Our clients will see that too, if we let them." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Alexander seized the moment. "I've made mistakes, but I've also learned from them. If we're going to move forward, we need to embrace change, not resist it." Meanwhile, Samantha faced her own battle. The negative press continued to hound her, with paparazzi lurking near her apartment and strangers hurling cruel remarks online. One afternoon, as she picked Ethan up from daycare, she overheard another mother whispering, "Did you see the news? That's her. The woman who trapped a billionaire." Samantha clenched her fists, holding back tears as she led Ethan away. Later, at home, she confided in Mary, "I'm trying so hard, Mary, but it feels like the whole world is against me." Mary placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Sam. Don't let them win. Focus on what matters, Ethan and the future you're building." Amid the turmoil, Ethan remained a source of light. One evening, as Alexander joined Samantha and Ethan for dinner, the little boy proudly showed off a drawing he had made at daycare. "This is us," Ethan announced, pointing to the crayon figures on the page. "Me, Mommy, and Daddy. We're happy." The simplicity of Ethan's words brought a lump to Samantha's throat. She exchanged a glance with Alexander, who smiled softly. "Looks like you've got some artistic talent," Alexander said, ruffling Ethan's hair. Ethan beamed. "When I grow up, I want to build big buildings like you, Daddy." Alexander's heart swelled. You can do anything you set your mind to, buddy. The following week, Alexander took Samantha and Ethan to an exclusive charity gala hosted by Carter Industries. It was their first public appearance as a family, and the stakes were high. As they entered the opulent ballroom, all eyes turned to them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some curious, others judgmental. Samantha felt a wave of anxiety, but straightened her shoulders, determined not to let fear win. Remember, Alexander whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her back. You belong here. During the event, Alexander gave a heartfelt speech about the importance of using wealth and influence for good. He highlighted the company's new initiatives focused on social responsibility, tying his personal journey into the narrative. For too long, I focused on success as a measure of worth, Alexander said. But Mimili, Samantha, and Ethan taught me that true success lies in the lives we touch and the legacy we leave behind. The audience erupted in applause, and Samantha felt a surge of pride. For the first time, she saw Alexander not as the cold businessman she'd first met, but as a man striving to be better. After the gala, Margaret pulled Samantha aside. You handled yourself beautifully tonight, she said with a warm smile. Thank you, Samantha replied, though her voice wavered. But it's still overwhelming. Margaret nodded. That's normal. Growth always comes with discomfort. But you're not alone, Samantha. Lean on the people who love you. Samantha glanced across the room at Alexander, who was speaking with a group of investors. It's just hard to trust, after everything I've been through. Margaret squeezed her hand. Trust takes time, but it's worth it. Don't let fear keep you from embracing the happiness you deserve. Their progress was soon tested when Ethan fell ill with a high fever. Samantha stayed by his side through sleepless nights, while Alexander coordinated with doctors to ensure Ethan received the best care. One particularly difficult night, as they sat together in the hospital waiting room, Samantha broke down. I can't do this alone, Alexander. I'm scared. He took her hand, his voice steady. You're not alone, Samantha. We're in this together. In that moment, something shifted between them, a shared vulnerability that strengthened their bond. As Ethan recovered, Alexander and Samantha realized they needed a plan to shield their family from further media scrutiny. They decided to issue a joint statement, addressing the rumors head-on and emphasizing their commitment to building a future together. The statement read, in part, we are not defined by our past mistakes, but by our willingness to grow and move forward. Our priority is our son, Ethan, and creating a life filled with love, respect, and integrity. The response was overwhelming. Support poured in from unexpected corners, and public perception began to shift in their favor. The foundation of Alexander and Samantha's relationship had been tested through fire, but now they faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding their lives while ensuring a stable future for Ethan. As they ventured into this new chapter, their bond deepened through trials, triumphs, and a shared commitment to healing the past. With public scrutiny still lingering, Alexander and Samantha worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, not just with the world, but with each other. One afternoon, Alexander surprised Samantha with a visit to the community shelter where she once lived. He had been working behind the scenes to fund renovations, turning the dilapidated space into a haven for those in need. I wanted to give back, Alexander said, as they walked through the brightly painted halls. You showed me what real resilience looks like, and I want to honor that. Samantha's eyes welled up with tears. This is incredible, Alexander. Thank you. They paused in the newly refurbished playroom, watching children laugh and play. Samantha turned to him. "You've come so far. It's hard to believe this is the same man I met on that cold street." He smiled softly. "Meeting you changed everything." As Ethan grew, his curiosity and charm captivated everyone around him. One day, he tugged on Alexander's sleeve as they sat together building a block tower. "Daddy, why do people look at us funny?" Ethan asked, his innocent green eyes searching for answers. Alexander hesitated, but decided to be honest. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different, buddy. But what matters is that we love each other, no matter what anyone thinks." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I love you, Daddy." Alexander hugged his son tightly, the simple words filling a void he hadn't realized was still there. Determined to create a better life for Ethan, Samantha enrolled in night classes to complete her degree in education. The balancing act was grueling, juggling coursework, motherhood, and public scrutiny. But she persevered with grit and determination. One evening, as she struggled with a particularly challenging assignment, Alexander walked into the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Need a study buddy?" he asked with a grin. Samantha laughed, the stress momentarily lifting. "I might take you up on that." Their shared laughter echoed through the house, a reminder of how far they had come. At Carter Industries, Alexander faced mounting pressure to prove that the company's new direction could succeed. Despite the initial backlash from investors, his initiatives in corporate responsibility began to gain traction. During a tense board meeting, Charles Manning, his staunchest critic, challenged Alexander once again. "This idealistic vision of yours is costing us, Alexander. We need profits, not platitudes." Alexander stood his ground. "Profits and purpose aren't mutually exclusive, Charles. The world is changing, and so must we. If we invest in our communities and the environment, the returns will follow, not just financially, but in trust and loyalty." The boardroom fell silent, his words sinking in. Slowly, nods of agreement began to spread around the table. One weekend, Alexander took Samantha and Ethan to his family's country estate. As they strolled through the sprawling gardens, he opened up about his childhood for the first time. "My parents were distant," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "They believed success was all that mattered. I don't want Ethan to grow up feeling the way I did." Samantha placed a hand on his arm. "You're breaking that cycle, Alexander. Ethan knows he's loved. That's what matters." Under the golden glow of the setting sun, Alexander felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He realized that his wealth and power meant nothing without the people who gave his life meaning. In the weeks that followed, Alexander grew increasingly certain that he wanted Samantha and Ethan to be part of his life permanently. One crisp autumn evening, he invited Samantha to dinner at her favorite restaurant. As they sat beneath twinkling fairy lights, Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Samantha," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've taught me what it means to love and be loved. You've given me a second chance at life, and I don't want to waste a moment of it. Will you marry me?" Samantha gasped, her eyes shining with tears. For a moment she was speechless, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will." Applause erupted from the nearby tables, but Alexander and Samantha only had eyes for each other. For the first time, they felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. News of their engagement spread quickly, reigniting public interest in their story. While most reactions were positive, a vocal minority criticized Samantha, accusing her of gold digging. Samantha struggled to ignore the negativity, but it wore on her. One day, she confided in Margaret. "I thought things would get easier, but it feels like I'm constantly being judged." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "People will always have opinions, Samantha. What matters is that you know your truth and that you hold your head high." To Samantha's surprise, Alexander's mother, Evelyn Carter, reached out to her. The two women met for tea, and Evelyn, known for her frosty demeanor, seemed surprisingly warm. "I'll admit, I had my reservations," Evelyn said candidly. "But seeing the way Alexander looks at you and how you've stood by him, I can't deny that you've been good for him." Samantha smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. That means more than you know. The journey to true happiness is rarely smooth, and for Alexander and Samantha, their new life together brought unforeseen challenges that tested their love, their resilience, and their vision for the future. The months leading up to Alexander and Samantha's wedding were filled with excitement, but also immense pressure. The media's obsession with their story amplified every detail of their relationship, often painting Samantha in a negative light. At a fitting for her wedding dress, Samantha confided in Mary Lopez, her closest friend from the shelter. "Sometimes I wonder if I can handle this, Mary. The constant judgment, the prying eyes." Mary squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've been through worse, Samantha. Don't let them take away your joy. You deserve this happiness." Despite the negativity, Samantha focused on the positive moments. Ethan practicing his role as ring bearer, Alexander surprising her with quiet dinners amidst their busy schedules, and the overwhelming support from those who truly mattered. Meanwhile, at Carter Industries, Alexander faced a critical threat. An anonymous whistleblower accused the company of unethical practices in a division he had inherited. While Alexander had been working to reform the company, this accusation had the potential to undo all his progress. Samuel, Alexander's trusted CFO, walked into his office one morning with a grim expression. "Alexander, this report is gaining traction. If we don't address it quickly, it could destroy our reputation and your leadership." Alexander clenched his jaw. "I'll handle it. Transparency has been my cornerstone since I took over. Let's get to the bottom of this." Samantha noticed Alexander's growing tension and tried to support him. One evening, as they sat together reviewing documents, she placed a hand on his. "You're not alone in this. We'll face it together." Her unwavering belief in him bolstered his determination. Amidst the chaos, Ethan began to ask more questions about his family. One evening, while looking through an old photo album with Alexander, Ethan pointed to a picture of a young Alexander with his stern-looking father. "Daddy, who's that? Why does he look so serious?" Alexander hesitated, the memories flooding back. "That's your grandfather. He was a complicated man." Samantha joined them, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Your daddy is working hard to make sure our family is different, Ethan. We want you to always feel loved." Ethan hugged them both tightly. "I do. I love you, Mommy and Daddy." Determined to reclaim her own narrative, Samantha accepted an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment event. Her speech, titled "From Rock Bottom to Redemption," resonated deeply with the audience. "I'm not defined by where I started," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm defined by how I chose to rise. And I'm here to tell every woman listening, your past does not dictate your future." Alexander, seated in the audience, watched with pride as Samantha received a standing ovation. Later, he told her, "You're incredible. Never doubt that." The long-awaited wedding day finally arrived, held at a picturesque vineyard, surrounded by close friends and family. The ceremony was intimate, filled with heartfelt vows and joyful laughter. As Samantha walked down the aisle, Ethan beside her as ring bearer, Alexander felt a wave of emotion, unlike anything he had ever experienced. In his vows, he promised not only to love Samantha, but also to honor the family they had built together. Samantha's vows were equally moving. "You taught me to trust again, to believe in second chances. I promise to stand by you through every challenge and triumph." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. Ethan cheered the loudest, running up to hug them both. Alexander and Samantha's honeymoon plans were cut short when the situation at Carter Industries escalated. New evidence suggested the whistleblower might be connected to a competitor seeking to undermine Alexander's reforms. Returning to the city, Alexander met with his team to strategize. "We need full transparency," he insisted. "If there's any truth to these allegations, we'll address it head-on." Samantha, now accustomed to balancing her roles as a wife and mother with the public spotlight, encouraged him. "This is your chance to show everyone what integrity looks like." At a press conference, Alexander addressed the allegations directly. "I won't deny that mistakes were made in the past," he said, his tone resolute. "But under my leadership, we've taken every step to rectify them. Today, I'm announcing a new initiative to ensure accountability at every level of our organization." The press grilled him with tough questions, but Alexander remained composed. Samantha watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. His commitment to doing the right thing, no matter the cost, reaffirmed her faith in him. Amidst the turmoil, Ethan reached a milestone of his own, his first school play. Dressed as a tree, he delivered his one line with enthusiasm, earning a round of applause from the audience. After the performance, Samantha knelt down to hug him. "You were amazing, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Alexander ruffled Ethan's hair. "That was the best tree I've ever seen." Ethan beamed, his innocence a welcome reprieve from the challenges they faced. One evening, as Alexander reviewed reports late into the night, Samantha brought him a cup of tea. "You can't fix everything in one day," she said gently. "Don't forget to take care of yourself." Alexander looked at her, his expression softening. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you, Samantha. You remind me of what's truly important." They sat together in silence, the weight of their journey evident, but their bond stronger than ever. As the chapter closed, Alexander and Samantha prepared to face the next stage of their journey with renewed determination. They had learned that resilience wasn't about avoiding challenges, but about facing them together, with love as their guiding force. Standing on the balcony of their home, watching Ethan play in the yard, Samantha turned to Alexander. "We've come so far. And we're just getting started," he replied, echoing her earlier words with a smile. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, a testament to their enduring hope and the future they were building together. Life seemed to settle into a rhythm for Alexander, Samantha, and Ethan. The challenges they faced, both as individuals and as a family, had shaped them into stronger versions of themselves. Yet, the road ahead was not without its hurdles, as the couple decided to turn their personal triumphs into a force for good in their community. Inspired by their journey, Alexander and Samantha launched the Carter Foundation, dedicated to supporting underprivileged families, focusing on education, housing, and healthcare. The foundation became a passion project for Samantha, who poured her heart into its development. During the inaugural board meeting, Samantha presented her vision. "This foundation isn't just about charity," she said passionately. "It's about giving people the tools and opportunities to rebuild their lives, just as I was given." The board, made up of accomplished professionals and advocates, applauded her clarity and vision. Despite the foundation's noble goals, not everyone welcomed the initiative. Critics accused Alexander of using the foundation to rehabilitate his image after the scandal at Carter Industries. At a press conference, a reporter asked, "Mr. Carter, some claim this foundation is a PR stunt to distract from the company's recent controversies. How do you respond?" Alexander's voice was steady but firm. "This foundation is not about me or my past. It's about creating a future where no child has to endure what my son almost did. Actions will speak louder than words, and I invite anyone to see the impact we're making." Samantha, standing beside him, added, "I'm living proof of what second chances can achieve. That's what this foundation is about, hope and opportunity." Their sincerity resonated with many, though some skeptics remained unconvinced. As the Carter Foundation's initiatives took shape, Ethan became an unintentional mascot for their efforts. During a visit to a local shelter supported by the foundation, Ethan befriended a boy named Caleb, who was around his age. Caleb, shy at first, opened up when Ethan shared his favorite superhero toys. "Mom says we'll get a house soon," Caleb said, his eyes shining with hope. Ethan later asked Samantha, "Mommy, can Caleb live with us until he gets his house?" Samantha smiled, her heart aching with pride and sadness. "We're helping Caleb's family find a place of their own, sweetheart. And because of you, he knows he's not alone." One of the foundation's early housing projects faced resistance from local residents. At a town hall meeting, Samantha and Alexander listened to heated debates. "This development will lower property values," one man shouted. "Why should we pay for other people's problems?" another added. Samantha stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I understand your concerns, but I ask you to consider this. What kind of community do we want to be? One that builds walls, or one that builds bridges? These families aren't asking for a handout. They are asking for a chance to stand on their own." Her words silenced the room momentarily. A woman in the back stood up, saying, "She's right. We've all needed help at some point. Let's give these families a chance." Gradually, the tide began to turn, but not without lingering opposition. In the midst of their community work, Samantha received an unexpected letter from her estranged sister, Claire. "Dear Samantha, I saw your story on the news, and I couldn't believe it was you. I've thought about you so much over the years and wondered if you'd ever forgive me for turning my back when you needed me most. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet and make things right. Love." Claire. Samantha showed the letter to Alexander, her emotions a mix of hope and apprehension. "I don't know if I can forgive her, Alex. She abandoned me when I was at my lowest." Alexander took her hand. "Only you can decide, but sometimes forgiveness is more for us than for them." Samantha agreed to meet Claire, and their reunion was bittersweet. Claire apologized profusely, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared and didn't know how to help. I'm so sorry, Samantha." While it wasn't easy, Samantha began the process of rebuilding their relationship, knowing it was another step toward healing. At Carter Industries, Alexander worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. The implementation of new sustainability practices and the Transparency Initiative began to yield positive results. Profits stabilized and employee morale improved. During an investor meeting, one shareholder stood up. "Mr. Carter, you've proven that doing the right thing doesn't mean sacrificing success. I think I speak for many when I say, thank you for showing us a better way." For Alexander, these words were a validation of his journey, a reminder of why he had chosen this path. As the foundation grew, so did Ethan. His kindergarten graduation was a moment of pure joy for Samantha and Alexander. Watching him on stage, clutching his tiny diploma, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. After the ceremony, Ethan ran to them, grinning. "Did I do good, Mommy? Daddy?" Alexander lifted him into his arms. "You were amazing, champ. We're so proud of you." The Carter Foundation's impact began to extend beyond New York. Other cities reached out, hoping to replicate their model for supporting families in need. During a televised interview, Samantha spoke about their vision. "This isn't just about one foundation or one city. It's about creating a ripple effect of kindness and opportunity. Together, we can change lives." The interviewer asked, "What motivates you to keep going?" Samantha glanced at Alexander and Ethan, smiling. "Family, knowing that we're building a better world for our son and every child like him." As the chapter drew to a close, Alexander and Samantha stood together on the balcony of their home, watching Ethan play with Caleb and other children from the community. "We've built something real, haven't we?" Samantha said softly. Alexander nodded. "And it's just the beginning." The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the challenges they had faced and the brighter future they were shaping, one step, one family, and one act of kindness at a time. The Carter Foundation's rapid growth brought both praise and pressure. As their influence expanded, so did the scrutiny. Media outlets started digging into Alexander and Samantha's past, while internal challenges tested the Foundation's mission and their family's strength. It began with a headline in a major newspaper: "The Carter Foundation, Charity or Redemption Scheme." The article, though speculative, unearthed Alexander's controversial corporate history and Samantha's difficult past. Other outlets followed, amplifying the narrative. At breakfast, Samantha scrolled through her phone, her face pale. "Alex, look at this." Alexander, sipping his coffee, took her phone and read the article. His jaw tightened. "They're painting us as frauds," he said, his voice low but furious. "What do we do?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking. "We stick to the truth," Alexander replied. "But this means we need to be prepared for more attacks. They'll dig into everything." The media storm soon extended to Ethan. A photo of him at a foundation event circulated online, leading to cruel comments questioning Alexander and Samantha's fitness as parents. At school, Ethan overheard two older kids whispering. "That's the kid from the news," one said. "I heard his mom used to live on the streets." Ethan, confused and hurt, came home in tears. "Mommy, why are people saying bad things about us?" Samantha hugged him tightly, her heart breaking. "Because sometimes people don't understand what's important, sweetheart. But we know the truth, and that's what matters." Alexander knelt beside them. "Ethan, people may say things that aren't true, but we're a family. Nothing can change that." The Foundation's board held an emergency meeting to address the negative press. Some members expressed concerns about Alexander's leadership. "We've come too far to let this tarnish our reputation," one board member said. "Perhaps it's time to consider a leadership change." Samantha, who rarely spoke during board meetings, stood up. "This foundation wouldn't exist without Alexander. He's the reason we've been able to help so many families. Turning on him now would be a betrayal of everything we stand for." Her words were met with silence, but Alexander could see doubt in the board members' eyes. The mounting pressure took a toll on Alexander and Samantha's relationship. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, they argued in the kitchen. "You should have let me handle the board," Alexander said, pacing. "They needed to hear the truth," Samantha replied, her voice firm. "Do you think I don't know what I'm doing?" Alexander snapped. Samantha crossed her arms. "This isn't just about you, Alex. It's about all of us. You can't carry everything alone." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying, Sam. but sometimes it feels like the whole world is against us." She softened, stepping closer. "We're in this together, Alex. Don't shut me out." He pulled her into a hug, the tension easing but not disappearing entirely. As tensions rose, an internal scandal rocked the foundation. A trusted staff member, Jason Turner, was caught embezzling funds. Samantha discovered discrepancies in the budget during a routine review. "This doesn't add up," she said, showing the numbers to Alexander. Jason initially denied the accusations, but eventually confessed under pressure. "I needed the money," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't think anyone would notice." Alexander's disappointment was palpable. "You betrayed the trust of every family we're trying to help." The scandal leaked to the media, further damaging the foundation's reputation. Critics claimed it was proof of poor management. The pressure finally culminated in a public protest outside the foundation's headquarters. Protesters held signs reading, "Charity begins with honesty," and "The Carter Foundation False Hope." Inside the building, Samantha watched the scene with a heavy heart. "We've done everything right, Alex. Why does it feel like we're losing?" Alexander looked out the window, his face hard. "Because doing the right thing isn't always enough, but we can't let them win." That night, Alexander called a press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters, he addressed the controversies head-on. "Our foundation has made mistakes, and we take full responsibility. But our mission has never wavered: to help families in need. We won't let setbacks define us. We'll learn, we'll grow, and we'll keep fighting for what's right." His speech was met with mixed reactions, but it reignited support from many who believed in the foundation's mission. Amid the turmoil, Ethan offered a moment of clarity. One evening, as the family sat in their living room, Ethan said, "Maybe people don't like us because they don't know us. Can we tell them our story?" Samantha and Alexander exchanged a look, realizing the wisdom in their son's words. The next day, Samantha shared a heartfelt post on social media, detailing her journey from homelessness to hope. "I'm not ashamed of my past," she wrote. "It's what led me to where I am today. And it's why I believe so strongly in what we're doing at the Carter Foundation." The post went viral, sparking an outpouring of support from people who resonated with her story. Slowly but surely, the foundation began to rebuild its reputation. Donations increased, and volunteers poured in to support their initiatives. During a televised interview, a journalist asked Alexander, "What keeps you going despite all the challenges?" He smiled, glancing at Samantha and Ethan in the audience. "My family. They remind me every day why this work matters." As the chapter ended, Alexander and Samantha stood together on the rooftop of their office building, watching the city lights. "We've weathered the storm," Samantha said, leaning against him. "And we're stronger for it," Alexander replied, his arm around her. Below them, the Carter Foundation's logo shone brightly, a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of second chances. The Carter Foundation had emerged from the storm, but the scars remained. Alexander and Samantha knew rebuilding trust was only the beginning. Their focus shifted to creating lasting change, both for their family and the world. Ethan's idea of sharing their story continued to resonate. At school, he worked on a project titled "From Shadows to Light: My Family's Journey." He presented it during a community event hosted by the Carter Foundation, moving the audience with his sincerity. "I learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Ethan said, holding the microphone with steady hands. "It means doing what's right, even when it's hard. My parents showed me that." The applause was thunderous. Alexander, watching from the crowd, felt a lump in his throat. Samantha squeezed his hand. "That's your son," she whispered, pride glowing in her eyes. Alexander proposed a groundbreaking initiative, the Carter Fellowship, offering scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged youth. We're not just giving them money, Alexander explained during a board meeting. We're giving them a chance to rewrite their stories. The program launched with a gala event where former beneficiaries of the foundation shared their stories. Margaret Daniels, a once struggling single mother who received help years ago, spoke passionately. The Carter Foundation didn't just save my life, it gave me the tools to build a future. Now, I'm here to help others do the same. The event raised millions, exceeding expectations and silencing skeptics. Amid the progress, Alexander faced an unexpected challenge, a confrontation with his estranged father, Richard Carter. Richard, once a titan of industry, had disapproved of Alexander's turn towards philanthropy. But now, seeing his son's success, he sought a meeting. "I didn't think you had it in you," Richard admitted, his voice gruff. Alexander stared at him, emotions churning. "You taught me to be ruthless. I had to unlearn that to become who I am now." Richard nodded slowly. "Maybe I was wrong. But you've done something remarkable, Alex. Something I never could. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start." Samantha achieved a personal milestone by completing her education and earning a degree in social work. At her graduation ceremony, she gave a speech that left not a single dry eye in the audience. "When I was at my lowest, I thought I'd never stand here today. But I learned that life isn't just about surviving. It's about thriving. And I want to dedicate this achievement to every person who's still searching for hope. You're stronger than you know." Ethan cheered the loudest, his voice echoing in the auditorium. One evening, the family visited the homeless shelter where Samantha once stayed. Ethan handed out food to children, while Samantha spoke to women seeking help. A woman approached her hesitantly. "You're Samantha Carter, right? I saw your story online. It gave me hope." Samantha smiled warmly. "That's why I shared it. You're not alone." Alexander watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. This was the legacy they were building, one of compassion, resilience, and impact. Determined to show Ethan where it all began, Alexander and Samantha took him to the corner where they first met. "This is where Mommy and I had our first conversation," Alexander said, his voice tinged with emotion. Samantha laughed softly. "You were so cold back then. I never thought you'd be the man you are today." Ethan looked at them both, wide-eyed. "So, this is where our story started?" Alexander nodded. "Yes, and it's proof that even in the darkest moments, something beautiful can begin." As the chapter closed, the Carter Foundation prepared for its largest project yet, building an eco-friendly community center in an underserved neighborhood. During the groundbreaking ceremony, Samantha cut the ribbon, surrounded by supporters. Alexander gave a speech that encapsulated their journey. "We started as two individuals with little in common, brought together by fate. Today we stand united, not just as a family, but as a force for good. This isn't the end of our story. It's the beginning of something greater." The crowd erupted in applause, but for Alexander and Samantha, the true reward was the impact they were making. That night, as they stood on the balcony of their home, Samantha rested her head on Alexander's shoulder. "We've come so far," she murmured. "And we're just getting started," Alexander replied, his arm around her. Ethan joined them, holding a telescope. "The stars are so bright tonight." Alexander looked up, his heart full. "They are, just like the future." As a shooting star streaked across the sky, the family made silent wishes. Together, they had turned pain into purpose, proving that redemption wasn't just possible, It was transformative. The Carter Foundation was now a beacon of hope. Its projects spanned across the country, touching countless lives. Alexander and Samantha's story had inspired a movement, attracting not just funding, but also volunteers eager to make a difference. Ethan, now 8 years old, had become a symbol of resilience and innocence. His presence at events often melted hearts, especially when he spoke about his parents' journey. "Mom and Dad taught me that anyone can change the world," he said at a recent gala, his voice filled with conviction. "You just have to start." As the foundation grew, so did its reach. The eco-friendly community center, named the Ethan Center for Hope, opened with great fanfare. Designed to be a safe haven for families in need, it featured job training programs, childcare services, and even a library stocked with books donated by supporters. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Samantha addressed the crowd. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "This isn't just a building, it's a promise that no one has to face hardship alone. Together, we can create opportunities where there once were none." The applause was deafening. Standing beside her, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was their legacy, a testament to their shared vision. Ethan had his own way of contributing. He started a campaign called Kids for Kindness, encouraging children to donate toys, clothes, and school supplies to those in need. His infectious enthusiasm quickly gained traction, and soon, schools nationwide were participating. During one collection drive, Ethan visited a school to personally thank the students. Holding a stuffed bear, he said, "This bear might not seem like much, but to a kid without one, it's everything." The simplicity of his message resonated deeply, earning media attention and further elevating the foundation's profile. One of the most profound moments came when Alexander decided to mend his relationship with his estranged father, Richard Carter. After years of silence, he extended an olive branch. "I've made mistakes, Dad," Alexander admitted during their meeting. "But I've also learned that it's never too late to change. I want us to try again." Richard, though hesitant, agreed. Over time, he began to see the man Alexander had become. A compassionate leader, a devoted husband, and a loving father. It wasn't easy, but the process of reconciliation brought a sense of closure to both men. The path wasn't without obstacles. Not everyone celebrated the Carters' success. Skeptics questioned their motives, and competitors tried to discredit their efforts. A particularly scathing article accused the foundation of being a publicity stunt. Instead of reacting defensively, Samantha addressed the criticism head-on during an interview. "We're not perfect, and we've never claimed to be. What matters is that we're trying every single day to make a difference. If that's something worth criticizing, so be it." Her candor won over many detractors, solidifying the Carters' reputation as genuine change-makers. With momentum on their side, the foundation expanded its initiatives internationally. They partnered with organizations in developing countries, addressing issues like clean water access, education, and women's empowerment. During a visit to a rural village in Kenya, Samantha and Alexander were moved by the community's gratitude. A local elder presented them with a handmade tapestry symbolizing unity. "This is not just for what you've given us," the elder said, his voice warm. "It's for reminding us that we matter." Despite their busy schedules, Alexander and Samantha prioritized family time. Evenings were spent reading bedtime stories to Ethan, baking cookies, or simply stargazing on their balcony. One night, Ethan asked, "Mom, Dad, do you think I can run the foundation one day?" Alexander smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "You can do anything you set your mind to, buddy. But remember, leadership isn't about being the boss. It's about serving others. The culmination of their journey came at an international summit on philanthropy. Alexander was invited to give the keynote address. Standing before a crowd of thousands, he reflected on their remarkable transformation. 2 years ago, I was a man lost in the pursuit of wealth. Today, I stand here as someone who's learned the true meaning of success. It's not measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch, the hope you inspire, and the change you create. His words earned a standing ovation. Among the audience was Samantha, tears streaming down her face. Ethan, seated beside her, clapped enthusiastically. Before returning home, the family visited the street corner where Alexander and Samantha first met. It was a cold winter evening, much like the one that started their journey. Alexander knelt beside Ethan. "This is where it all began, son." Ethan looked up, curious. "Did you know back then that Mom was special?" Samantha laughed softly. "He didn't, but I made sure he figured it out." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of their story sink in. Back home, the Carters reflected on their journey. Their lives had been forever changed, not just by their choices, but by the people they had met along the way. As they prepared for the next chapter, Samantha turned to Alexander. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "Every day," he replied, pulling her close, "and I can't wait to see where we go next." That night, as the city lights twinkled outside their window, Alexander, Samantha, and Ethan sat together, dreaming of the future. Their story, once filled with pain and struggle, had become one of hope and triumph. And though the challenges would never cease, they knew they had the strength to face them together. Every great story has a beginning, and this one is no different. But what truly makes it special is your voice. What do you think about Alexander and Samantha's journey? Did their transformation inspire you, or do you see parts of yourself in their struggles and triumphs? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And this is just the start. Life has a way of surprising us, and there's always more to uncover, more lessons to learn, and more hearts to touch. So, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to join us for the next chapter. Together, let's explore stories that move us, inspire us, and remind us of what truly matters. Until next time, remember, every moment is a chance to change the narrative. See you soon.